Hello guys, and this is the first episode of An Open Mind Makes Good Stories, and for this first episode it is hauntings surrounding Yorkshire, which is where I am from, and I hope you enjoy. 30 East Drive sits on a battleground where a bloody siege happened during the Civil War in 1644. The estate is rather close to where the Pontefract Castle used to stand. 861 people from this battle were recorded as being murdered or died. Andy Evans, an author of a book that he wrote surrounding 30 East Drive's poltergeist activity, found that there once was an orchard there. This would strike interest of monks living and farming from this ground, and thus this is where the story starts of the Black Monk of Pontefract. As the story goes, one of the monks were executed because of the monk's violent crimes of kidnap, rape and murdering a young girl. The execution would have been just behind 30 East Drive, and then the monk would then be thrown into a well to rot for the rest of his time. Bill and Barbara, husband and wife, and their baby Jane, was the first recorded to have moved in to 30 East Drive. Bill and Barbara experienced weird happenings. Things like purposely placing tools, cups, papers, keys, anything that you would just remember or automatically know where they were, moved from the places that they'd put them. Or even furniture would be torn apart. Barbara never liked this place either, but they still had to live there. Jane, however, was the main reason why they fell off in this place. She would not be able to settle, sleep for days upon end, but rather in their grandma or any other place rather than that house, she would sleep peacefully all the way through the night. As soon as she would get back into 30 East Drive, it would be the same result over and over again, where baby Jane would never be able to sleep all the way through the night. The one time that has been recorded she did, she had woke up with red raw scratches all over her skin. This is where the next part of the story decides to flip. Bill and Barbara had decided to move out, and this was when Barbara was shopping in her usual shopping spots and found Jill Pitchard shopping along with them. They had begun talking and found that neither of them liked the house. Believe it or not, Joe and Jill only lived a couple of doors down from Bill and Barbara. When finding out that neither of them liked the house, they decided together that they was going to swap houses. Barbara went home. She insisted to move out and insisted to leave that house behind before something tragic would happen. This next part is all around the story of Joe and Jill Pitchard, their boy Philip, aged 15, and their girl Diane. On arrival to the 30 East Drive, Black Monk of Pontefract, Joe and Jill experienced very similar happenings to that of Barbara and Bill. The difference is that this time the two children were old enough to make up their own ideas of what was going on in this house. Not only that, but they were also old enough to understand what paranormal actually is. This is one of their most famous stories seen all over the internet. They were on holiday one year and their grandma was going over and looking after the children as, again, Phil and Diane were 15 and around 6 years old. They weren't old enough to look after themselves, so their grandma looked after them for them, whilst Joe and Jill ended up going over to a holiday resort. In this stay, their grandma found that she would all of a sudden get really cold flushes, and then all of a sudden see lights flashing, almost as if it was thundering and lightning. To anyone out there that isn't living in England, this would have been around August, which August is, yeah, it'll get rainy, but it's kind of an okay month so she was expecting it just to be a bit of a bad day that day. However, she come to find out that Philip had gone outside and was reading the entire day. When Philip came in, she noticed and turned round and asked him if it was getting bad out there. In doing so, Philip looked confused and asked what was going on. It's not bad out there. After all of this confusion that had lifted, Phil had got himself a drink, and his grandma decided to make her way back into the living room. This was when Phil had gone straight back into the living room to sit and watch TV for a little while. In doing so, he had stopped suddenly in the doorway of the living room, watching his grandma knit. He saw, and what he described to see, was almost a cloud-like mist surrounding his grandma, but there was also chalk. It was like a chalky type of white mist all the way around his grandma. His grandma looked up and saw this mist as well, and in doing so, she blamed Philip. Philip had swore that it weren't him, and it also wasn't like it was coming from the ceiling either. It was only around his grandma that he could see this white chalk mist. In all of this part of the confusion of what is happening, what is going on, why is there a chalky mist in the living room, they called their aunt. When the aunt came over, the mist had settled onto the floor, and all she was trying to do was clean it up. She went to the kitchen to grab all of the cleaning supplies that she could to try and clean this mess up, and in doing so found puddles of water all over the floors. She again tried to clean the puddles up, but as she was cleaning one puddle up, another would form right behind her. This would go on and on for a little while. Later on in that evening, just as all of the puddles had stopped and even it had been estimated that it was just condensation forming as they got a water supply kind of person out to make sure that it wasn't like a leaky pipe. Phil had gone back in to the kitchen to make himself some tea, and in doing so he found the tea dispenser had opened and closed and opened and closed itself, and would spill tea leaves everywhere. He had shouted to his grandma that it was happening again. His grandma flooded into the kitchen and would see the button of the tea dispenser being pressed in and out consistently, even after all of the tea had been spilled out onto the kitchen sides. His grandma all of a sudden screamed into the nothingness of the kitchen for someone to stop. In doing so, they heard a loud crash behind them. Bear in mind, this was later on in the night, and it was petrifying. Phil and his grandma Sarah had turned around into the hallway to try and investigate where this loud crash had gone. And it seemed like it was a plant pot that usually lived at the bottom of the stairs had somehow managed to get itself all the way up the stairs, but without its pot. Dirt had travelled halfway up the stairs, where the plant had just been left on the floor. The plant pot, however, was all the way up the stairs and smashed into pieces. After realising this, cupboards in the kitchen had started rattling, making loud noises, crashes, and shaking violently. They had gone over to the other side of the house and knocked on the neighbouring door, which was also part of their families. They had asked if they were doing any sort of construction work within that wall on that side of the house to see if it could have been just loud noises from the other side of the house. But for it to be that time of night, they were rather confused and just told them no, they were in bed. After knocking on the door of the neighbour's house, they went back, finding out that they didn't actually know what was causing the banging. They both agreed that they was going to forget everything and try and get some sleep. However, this wasn't in the plan for this poltergeist. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Philip woke up and was petrified at the wardrobe swaying for no reason whatsoever. Again, Philip ran to his nana's, and him and his grandma went straight back over to the neighbour's house and decided that they wanted to sleep there the night. They could not deal with this anymore. The neighbouring husband said that he had had enough of being woken up in the middle of the night by these knockings from the neighbour of saying what was going on next door. He decided that he was going in and finding out what was happening, but nothing had been that frightening other than knocks on top of knocks on top of knocks. The neighbouring husband went back to his house and decided that they were going to indulge in one of the ghost hunters in the neighbourhood. This ghost hunter, that night, went over to the neighbouring house, 30 East Drive, and investigated. He actually found absolutely nothing. No weird knocks, no shaking cupboards, no plant pots in random places. However, he did say that poltergeist activity tends to target pictures, and to the Pitchard's surprise, they ended up going back home to find a wedding frame picture smashed on the floor, with the picture ruined from the smashed glass, and just wait out until the next day when the pictures had returned home from their holiday. Once Joe and Jill Pitchard had got home, there wasn't a lot of activity around the house. They maybe had a couple of knocks that they just said was the house settling. However, after 2 years, they experienced a lot more. After the 2 years of silence from this poltergeist, more activity began again. This had started because of Diane wanting to change her room up and redecorate. Jill had decided that she was going to do as her daughter wishes and began to decorate her room. When she had finished for that day, she had put all of her paint supplies and her decorating things in the hallway, waiting for the next morning so that Diane could go to sleep peacefully in her own room. Jill had gone downstairs and went to grab some water or some sort of drink that night, and all of a sudden heard a crash. When she went and found out what it was, plant pots of many had been launched over the rooms and down the stairs, and there was dirt everywhere. In the mess, she again tried to clean it up, and as she was trying to clean it up, more and more things surrounding these decoration supplies had been starting to be launched at her. Paintbrushes flew past her face, and what I could only explain as like a curtain pole-ish thing flung out of Diane's room. Jill had scrambled and screamed in her own room, trying to avoid all of the commotion going on outside. In screaming, she woke up everyone. And at this point, and only this point, did Joe see what was going on with this poltergeist. And this is where the media took over the story. When the media took on the story, this was when Mr. Nobody had been born. This was the media's name for this poltergeist. However, the Pitchard family had begun to start calling it Fred. Further in this story, the attacks from the poltergeist moved from Philip to now Diane. Diane most nights would find her sheets flung across her room, or even some nights she would be flipped out of her bed and the mattress landing on top of her. Moving on from the activities from both of the little boy and the little girl that used to live there, their aunt used to go over, and she was very skeptical. She would turn round and say that it was just the kids. She would always blame it on the kids, and there was always some plausible explanation for all of this happening. But when she stayed there one night, she found this to be false. Her entire skepticism was just debunked completely because of this poltergeist. One morning, she said that her gloves had gone missing, but saying that it again was the kids, and there's always a plausible explanation. One hand would appear on the top of a door frame, and another on the bottom of the door frame, inches off of the floor, wearing the aunt's gloves. And once she saw that, she freaked out. She was terrified of what was in the house. She threw a boot at these hands, and once she had done that, the disembodied glove was beckoning her to follow. Obviously, nobody moved, and later, this disembodied hand would clench up, threatening to hurt the aunt. Moving on, once this had happened, the only plausible thing that they could try and figure out was to get an exorcist to try and get rid of the poltergeist. Because not only had it started getting more and more interactive with people in and out of the house, but it also got angrier and more violent and vicious, and the activity began to hurt people, not just scare them. The Pitchers had believed that the only way out of this would have been an exorcism. They had gone to their Christian church and asked for a priest to bless their house and do an exorcist. The priest was kind of a little bit against this, but he also understood. As soon as he walked in there, he said to the family that there was a demon in there. After the failed attempt at doing an exorcism, they had found that the activity had got so much worse, and with one night, Diane was walking up the stairs when she had all of a sudden got pulled to the ground by what seemed to be nothing. She had been grabbed by the throat and pinned against the wall, then dragged up the stairs by her throat, later discovering almost a claw-like print on her neck from where a no-hand mark would have been. This was the worst of the worst attacks from this house, and all of a sudden, the Pitchard's family had gone quiet. They never expressed any discomfort about the house again. They never expressed any sort of noises going on in this house. It just kind of dissipated in the media. Later on, it was discovered that people surrounding the 30 East Drive house did hear bangs and knocks and light flashes around the house, loud enough for them to hear it out on the streets. But the Pitchards would never speak of it again. Moving on from this gruesome past of the Pitchard family and the 30 East Drive, the Black Monk of Pontefract, it is recorded that today the poltergeist is still rather active, with things like phones being on full battery all of a sudden dying, beds fully being made all of a sudden with the sheets completely thrown over the room, and knocks seamlessly coming from nowhere, rattling and things being smashed or thrown throughout the nights. This is the past story of the Black Monk of Pontefract, 30 East Drive. Temple Newsam is a Grade 1 Jacobean house and is now known for being a museum. The Temple Newsam dates back to 1520. This was built on the land seized by royalty in 1307 by Sir Philip Darcy's family, which he would then get to live in this building in 1377. In 1537 it was again taken, however. Sir Thomas Darcy would be involved in crime, and this would lead to his execution, causing this house to be seized again by royalty. Earl and Countess of Lennox was given this building from King Henry VIII in 1544. Lord Darnley was born the year later. This would eventually lead to the marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Darnley in 1565. However, Darnley would be murdered in 1567. In the years of Darnley and Mary's marriage, the building would again be taken by the Crown and would remain there until 1603. In 1603, King James gifted it to the Duke of Lennox. In 1622, Arthur Ingram bought the Temple Newsam, and his family would stay in this house until 1922, when it would become open to the public as a museum. The stories go that Mary Ingram, one of the family members, was out at a party one night, dressed up, and her carriage was attacked by highwaymen. In this attack, she was robbed of her precious pearls that her grandfather had gifted her during her christening. Throughout time, it has been said that a little rhyme, said 3 times in a mirror, is to bring misfortune to whoever speaks it. This little rhyme goes as such: blue lady, you killed your blue baby. This is some sort of twisted mix between Bloody Mary and looking at the Robert the doll without permission. Once she was attacked, she had lost her pearls, her very precious pearls, her pearls that was given to her by her grandfather. In doing so, she went home that night, and what would come is mental health to her demise. What we now know as PTSD, they would not, and she would, the following day, find that she had forgotten all about the night previous. She would look in her usual places for her pearls, in her nightstand where she would usually keep them. However, in doing so, she never found them, and would frantically begin searching. She went weeks with eating hardly anything or having anything to drink. She would have no sleep because of the utter distraught that losing these pearls would give her. In days to come, she would eventually find her demise to her own mental health and die from the lack of eating, sleeping, and drinking. It is said that to this day, people all the time hear furniture moving, drawers opening and closing, and things smashing, as though someone is still looking for these pearls. You can also see on ghost hunting videos of the Temple Newsam that she comes through on spirit box sessions, a woman screaming, "Pearls, where are my pearls?" as though she's still looking for them to this day. Another ghostly story of the Temple Newsam is that of a girl named Phoebe, aged between 14 and 16. Phoebe was a young girl who worked in the Great House in 1704. At this point, she was a maid for the house and the sire, the Duke of Marlborough. It was this night that they were celebrating the battle won. I don't know how to pronounce that word, so I'm going to skip over it. If you want to know about the battle, please do your own research. Phoebe returned from taking the drink upstairs, and Phoebe had been caught by the eye of William Collinson, and he, throughout the party, was said that she just would not give him any attention. In doing so, he, I can imagine, felt quite uneased about Phoebe. Realising that she wasn't giving him any attention, he was determined that that night he would steal a kiss from Phoebe. In noticing she had left the party, he had followed her up the stairs, down the dark hallways. All she had at this point was a candle-lit light showing her way. The very spooky dark hallways, not lit by any artificial torches or anything like that. You can imagine that William Collinson coming out of the staircase after her was rather scary and very intimidating. It is said that William Collinson had suffocated the girl in the attempts to make her do what he wanted. In this, he would squeeze her so tight she would suffocate and die. However, a few versions of this story is also said that he had also raped her and assaulted her before her death. In panic, William Collinson realised he had committed such a heinous crime and would drag her body back down to the cellar to where a well stayed. He would struggle, but he would eventually throw Phoebe's lifeless body down the well for it to be soon found by others. In the commotion of this heinous crime, Phoebe had been noticed that she had gone from the party, and then all of a sudden they noticed that William had gone too. When they had realised this, they became wary of what was going on through the night's events. Noticing all of Phoebe's friends were on edge of William Collinson and how it was weird that both of them had vanished from the party. When this had came to the attention of Phoebe's friends, they explained to guards and to everyone in the party pretty much that Phoebe said no multiple times throughout the party with William's flirtation. This struck nerves throughout everybody, and everybody began to look for the 16-year-old girl in the house. They would come across the well, and sadly had come across the lifeless body of Phoebe. When in doing so, they tried to find William. William was nowhere to be seen. He had ran. When this had happened, they called every sort of guard, every sort of policing that they could to try and find William Collinson. They had found him eventually in a pub, drunk, and would confess immediately to the police. He was tried and hung for his heinous crime. This is the story of Phoebe in Temple Newsam. It is said that to this day you can still see a girl in the top of the stairs where she was hurt. It is also said that you can hear screams from the hallway she was hurt. It is believed that not only Phoebe stays there, a lot also believe that William Collinson had also started to be there. Other hauntings is that in the Gothic room of the West Wing in Temple Newsam, people hear alarm sounds and doors slamming, as though people are still searching for Phoebe, and the police is still sounding their sirens around the Temple Newsam. Another haunting of the Temple Newsam is called the Vintage Girl. A housekeeper of the Temple Newsam, whilst it was under surveillance of the Crown, a housekeeper one night was cleaning up and dusting throughout the house. She was there alone, and with no visitors there, she was not expecting the ghostly sight that she saw. She had seen a vintage girl with a pencil skirt and an updo hairstyle looking back at her while she was cleaning the floors. When she looked up and saw this girl, she instantly tried to run after her, thinking that no one should have been in the house. After following the girl, that sped into another room. Upon entering the room, she would find nothing and nobody out of place. There was no exit or entrance, other than the door she had just been coming through, and was also blocking. She looked around and saw no one and nothing. She to this day still swears down that she saw this girl in plain sight, as though it was just like me or you. These are the terrifying hauntings of the Temple Newsam. Scarborough Castle, the hauntings and the history. Scarborough Castle is located to North Yorkshire and is the 12th century castle. It is argued between whether or not it is of Vikings, Ascent, or Anglo-Saxons. However, the gist of the name, Scarborough, is the hill with the fort. The castle was found by William le Gros, and he would become Earl of York by King Stephen in 1138. The ownership of the castle wouldn't last long. However, because of a few years later, Henry II would take the crown and call for all castles to be returned to the crown. Henry, in 1159, would then begin to renovate the castle and spend £650 on the castle. In today's money, that would be more than £11 million. This was when the castle would change ownerships to King John, which had been known to visit the castle before taking ownership. He would then again spend £2,291 on the Scarborough Castle and the Scarborough lands. I don't want to search that up and figure out the roundabouts of millions of pounds that could cost, because that is a lot of numbers and I'm not good at maths. After Henry II's reign ended, Henry III would continue to hold the castle, which was when the castle became one of the greatest fortresses in England. In 1312, Edward II would bunker down with Piers Gaveston. Remember this guy, by the way. When Piers would take refuge. Piers was friends with Edward II before and after he was crowned. During the Barons' Rebellion, During the Barons' Rebellion, Gaveston had become the main target of attack. He would seek refuge in the Scarborough Castle, protected by his friend and his friend's soldiers, but would eventually be caught captive and beheaded in June of 1312 on a hill named Blacklow. In 1308, Lord Percy and his wife was granted the luxury of staying in the castle, and the next 40 years they would start to build a bakery, a brewery, and a kitchen in the inner baileys of the castle grounds. The Castle of Scarborough has seen many violent attacks over the years as well, because What better to add to the creepy castle than a bit of bloodshed? In 1536, however, the castle was handed away from the crown, and the castle lived through the rebellion against Henry VIII. This is when Sir Ralph declared his support to the king and would besieged in the castle. The castle was damaged by gunfire but was still successfully held. Then 20 years later, the castle was involved in another rebellion in 1557, when Thomas Stafford seized the castle and held it for 3 days, believing he could create a revolt against Queen Mary. However, the castle was easily taken, and Stafford and his men were executed. This part of the story will be important, but for now I'm going to skip a few steps in very short sentences. The castle is also going through, in the 1650s, a civil war, and the castle would then become prison, which became its main use until the 19th century. In the 20th century, World War I broke out, and in doing so, the castle took hits. So would the people of Scarborough. With more than 500 shells fired, 17 people would be killed, and more than 80 people would be injured. This was when a lot of the Scarborough castle had been damaged or destroyed. This would slowly become Scarborough's hotspot for tourism, and what would now be known, what we see and what we hear about today as the Scarborough Castle. For the hauntings, however, sightings involve Piers Gaveston. Piers Gaveston, again, was friends with Edward II and would seek refuge in the Scarborough Castle, protected by his friends and his friends' soldiers. I've already gone through this, so he would then be eventually caught and beheaded in June of 1312 on Blacklow Hill. The sightings of Piers Gaveston is said to remain at the castle and the castle grounds. A sighting of a man headless is said to roam the castle, very much so in the dark corners and hallways of the castle. It is said that Gaveston always liked a trick and a prank, and would always jump out and scare the people that would work for him, and this is what he still does in his death. For the Scarborough Castle, it is also said that tortured spirits laid stagnant in the grounds, haunting the castle after the 1557 rebellion, when Thomas Stafford, the self-claimed protector of the realms, was executed along with many of his followers in the rebellion. This has been Stacey Lee with the podcast An Open Mind Makes a Good Story, with the first episode, Hauntings and History of Yorkshire Places. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, like and comment below. Have a good night.